Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's presentation. This is part of our webinar series, Food Safety Education. Today we're covering plans and programs. So that is food facility requirements, essential tips for FDA readiness. Just some housekeeping notes before we begin. All the guest lines are muted. We do that just to keep the background noise down to a minimum. But please, if you have a question, use that Q&A console on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll be watching for those questions as they come in. And then also we will have a Q&A session at the end after the presentation. We'll answer all those questions for you. We are recording today's session, and if you want to share this information, we'll send it in follow-up email to you. You're welcome to share this information and the recording with colleagues within your enterprise, but please do keep it within your company. We do ask for your respect with that. So today, your guide is Fabiola Negron, and she holds a science degree in industrial microbiology with graduate coursework in food science and technology from the University of Puerto Rico. She's worked at Registrar Corp. It's coming up on 10 years, actually, and her team has reviewed and developed over 2,000 food safety plans spanning HACCP and food defense and FSVP and even more for FDA compliance. So in addition to her impressive credentials, today is Fabiola's birthday. So happy birthday, Fabiola. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Welcome, everyone. We're excited for you to join us today. Today, we're going to cover food safety regulations for food facilities. We're going to deep dive into the plans and programs components. We will talk about the applicability, exemptions, qualifications required to develop and implement these programs, some preliminary steps before you sit down and develop the plans and programs, and then go over some common observations from the FDA and from our perspective as consultants. And then we will go into the Q&A session. So before we begin, I would like to introduce what Registrar Corp does and what we've achieved. We are it's likely that we've already assisted some of you with, your food safety plans or labels, removing you from an import alert or helping you with prior notice, registrations. And we are the global leader in FDA regulatory compliance. For over 20 years, we have helped companies in the food, supplement, cosmetics, drugs, and medical device industries with their FDA requirements. We have assisted over 30,000 clients across 190 countries, and we have about 20 offices worldwide to provide support in your respective time zones and languages when possible. We offer services and software solutions to address your needs with a high rating of client satisfaction. Our specialists are highly qualified and experienced to give you the adequate advice and navigate the complexities of the FDA requirements. We are also ISO 27001 certified to ensure that the data that you share with us is protected. So we thank you for joining us today and for choosing us as your trusted FDA compliance resource. So now moving on to the topic of the day, the plans and programs. We will be discussing the main plans and programs that are required by the FDA for food facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods. These are food safety plans, supply chain program, recall plans, HACCP plans for seafood or juice, and food defense plans. You will likely need to develop and implement at least one or more of these in your facility unless an exemption applies. I will be describing each of the components to which facilities and activities these requirements apply to and the qualifications needed to develop and implement them. It is important to note that beginning January of 2026, you would also be required to have a traceability plan if your food falls within the high-risk foods identified by the FDA in the food traceability list. So we have a separate webinar series that covers traceability, but it is important to note that, starting January, you will include this in this group. So we will start off with preventive controls rule. This rule came into force as part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, and facilities have been required to comply with these requirements since 2016. We have two main rules under preventive controls, and these are 21 CFR 117, which applies to human foods, and 21 CFR 507, which applies to animal foods. These regulations apply to facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods intended for humans or animals. And the main requirements include writing and implementing a food safety plan, a supply chain program, and a recall plan. These plans must be developed and implemented by a preventive controls qualified individual or PCQI. There are some exemptions granted from the regulations when a business meets certain financial criteria. So if you meet the requirements for a very small business or qualified facility, you may be exempt from developing a food safety plan and supply chain program or a recall plan. You must determine your eligibility by calculating and considering the following. You must calculate your annual sales and market value of the food manufactured, processed, packed, or held, meaning unsold inventory that could be held for a fee as well. And know that food for human is calculated separately from food for animals. So these are two separate calculations. You must consider the sales and market value globally, not just the food that you export to the United States or distribute within the United States. You must include sold to other countries or locally as well. You must consider your entire business operations pertaining to food, including any subsidiaries and affiliates. You must also consider foods that are subject to other regulations besides the FDA. So meat and poultry under USDA would also be considered in these overall calculations. You must calculate the average of the annual sales and market value of the previous 3 years. For example, if you were performing calculations now, you must consider the years 2024, 2023, and 2022. The cutoff date is every December 31st. Every December 31st. So when December 31st comes at the end of this year, then you will calculate 2025, 2024, and 2023. Once you obtain those totals, you must also adjust that for inflation. So the FDA has published a guidance shared here in the third column, and this helps industry determine their eligibility for these exemptions and some examples. The FDA website also has a resource updated yearly to provide the inflation per year numbers. When you obtain your totals and averages, if you are below the 1 million US dollars for human foods or 2.5 million US dollars for animal foods, you will be eligible for the exemptions. Being eligible is not enough. You must submit a qualified facility attestation to the FDA, and this is a form where you provide the details of your operation, you attest your control measures for the food, and where you attach your financial calculations and evidence that you meet the financial criteria. The FDA will evaluate that and provide you with an email confirmation with their determination and establishing your status as a qualified facility. If you do not submit this attestation, you will be required to comply with the full requirements. So if you suspect that you might be eligible for these exemptions, do the calculations with a financial expert, make sure they're right, uh, compile the evidence for the FDA, and submit that qualified facility attestation to benefit from the exemptions. So let's dive into the food safety plan. These are typically developed per product category. You can group products that have similar characteristics and processing steps. But pro tip, do not try to group different categories and processes together. It can become very confusing to follow and can result in an inadequate plan. So, what is a food safety plan? These are the primary documents in a preventive controls food safety system that provides a systematic approach to the identification of food safety hazards that must be controlled to prevent or minimize the likelihood of foodborne illness or injury. So, this plan is composed of a hazard analysis, preventive controls, monitoring procedures, verification and validation, corrective actions, and reanalysis. You must develop a written hazard analysis to identify potential biological, chemical, and physical hazards, then assess the likelihood and severity of these hazards to determine if they require a preventive control. The preventive controls are the measures you will apply to minimize or prevent these significant hazards. Preventive controls are what is commonly known as a CCP in a HACCP system. So these would be equivalent. There are four types of process preventive controls, and they include allergen preventive controls to address undeclared allergens and allergen cross contact, sanitation preventive controls to prevent cross contamination and allergen cross contact as well, supply chain preventive controls for those controls that can only be applied by a supplier or other entities prior to receiving the product or raw material at your facility. This means the hazard will not be controlled in your process or by subsequent entities in the supply chain. Therefore, you must ensure that your suppliers apply the appropriate control and the hazard is effectively under control. Most preventive controls require to include monitoring, verification, and corrective actions. Certain process controls will also require validation. The monitoring procedures establish which parameters need to be reached and how they will be checked to ensure that the hazards are controlled. When you monitor the preventive controls, you will also need to check that the control measure is working as intended through verification activities. This can include sampling and testing of the product for different parameters such as pH, microbiological or chemical testing, or others. They need to be appropriate to ensure that the control measure was working effectively. Validation is when you have confirmed that the parameters you established for that preventive control are effective. The control measures determined achieve repeatable results to ensure food safety. As we mentioned, not every preventive control will require validation. A food safety plan must be reanalyzed at least every 3 years. This is the minor or the least requirement. However, whenever there are changes within that 3 year period that impact the process and food safety, like switching formulations, processing parameters, equipment, or packaging, and other parameters, the plan must be reanalyzed to make the necessary changes to the hazard analysis and preventive controls if applicable. So when these changes are made, it's important that you evaluate whether that change has an impact in food safety and modify your food safety plan accordingly. Now moving to the supply chain program, we mentioned this is required when a hazard needs to be controlled prior to receiving the product from your supplier or by a supplier, because there are no control measures that can or will be applied at subsequent steps in your process or by other entities further down in the supply chain. The supply chain program is also considered per category, but also per supplier. You can group similar products like in the previous plan to evaluate them together in your supply chain program, but you must consider each individual supplier's practices separately. You will understand this as we discuss the components below. So a supply chain program includes the procedures for approving and verifying that suppliers controlling significant hazards in received raw materials and ingredients that cannot be subsequently controlled. So you will need to conduct a hazard analysis of the raw materials or ingredients. This ties in with the hazard analysis conducted for the process because the controls applied at your processing steps will impact if a supply chain control is required for a particular raw material or product. You must know who are the entities controlling the hazards. So you must understand the supply chain before you to identify who is actually applying a control or who can prevent a hazard. Supply chains can be complex and sometimes a bit of a mystery as the products can pass through many entities prior to reaching your facility. However, the FDA requires that you know where your product is coming from and who is controlling the hazards. You could source a product from a vendor, but that entity is simply selling the product and it's not handling the product nor applying controls. So it is crucial that you identify who is controlling the hazards so the evaluation and verification of the right supplier can be conducted. And any food safety issues can be resolved promptly. Documentation and supply chain transparency are key. Once you have identified the entity responsible for controlling those hazards, you must evaluate their food safety practices and control measures that they apply to ensure they align with the preventive controls, with FDA requirements, and the hazards are properly controlled. This is why the supply chain program is per supplier in addition to considering the hazards of the product itself. Each supplier is evaluated separately and they could apply different controls, processing parameters, and have very different food safety practices. When control measures are applied by the supplier, you can determine the proper verification activities. These include sampling and testing, review of their food safety monitoring records, and or annual on-site audits. Please make sure that when choosing an on-site audit, that the scope of the audit verifies the type of food and the process. You must evaluate to ensure that the audit covers the appropriate control measures, and if it does not, then you should have a mix of verification activities to fill any gaps that the audit did not cover. For example, if your raw material requires your supplier to have a food safety plan, then you would ensure that they have a food safety plan in place and that it's appropriate. If your on-site audit does not cover a review of their food safety plan, it would not be deemed appropriate for that type of verification. As part of the food safety plan, the supply chain program also requires a reanalysis at least every 3 years. So when there's changes in your products, in the raw materials that you're receiving from a particular supplier, you must ensure that you make the switch or the changes necessary to address the differences. Now, the recall plan is also considered part of the food safety plan, and a recall plan is a set of documents delineating the procedures and responsibilities for investigating, deciding, and carrying out a recall event. When a significant hazard requiring a preventive control is identified in your hazard analysis, you must have a recall plan in place. The recall plan must be written step by step, and these steps must include a detailed description with instructions. In addition to the instructions for the steps, it must be predetermined who is responsible for carrying out each step. The time of a recall event is not a time to try to have meetings to figure out who will do what, as time is of the essence. The longer that product is out there being distributed, it becomes more of a hazard to the consumers. So you must have procedures and templates for communicating recalls to the direct consignees, the authorities, and the public as applicable. You must have the pertinent information at hand to give clear instructions for identifying the affected product, have lot numbers, what to do with the products, how the product will be disposed of, contacts for asking questions, and others. You should also have different ways of communicating to ensure that your consignees or the public have received the message. So in the case of your consignees, emailing them, trying by phone, by physical mail. So try different communication measures to ensure that they have received the message and that they confirm to you that the message has been received. Document all communication in writing for your records. After you've notified the consignees, you will periodically conduct effectiveness checks to verify that the recall is being carried out successfully. You will track the different stages of the recall to document the progress, who has acknowledged your notification, the percentage of retrieval of the food, and other parameters. Also determine where you need to follow up on communications and take further actions. You must have instructions of what you will do once the product is retrieved or received at your facility. It needs to be segregated and accounted for. How will you dispose of it? Will it be reworked or destroyed? Depending on the situation, the FDA may require mandatory destruction under their supervision or in a specific manner. So it's just a matter of communicating with FDA and learning how they would like you to proceed. A recall plan also has the same 3-year reanalysis requirement as it is part of the food safety plan as well. You must reanalyze when changes impact the recall plan components, such as changes in your systems or traceability softwares that you use, if you no longer control significant hazards, or there are changes in the roles or responsibilities within the organization. If you undergo a recall and find deficiencies in the execution of the recall, then you will also make changes to ensure that you have covered that gap. We also recommend doing mock recalls. So these are fake drills where your recall team would pretend to have a recall and go step by step through the recall plan and just measure how long it takes to identify an affected product, contact all consignees. So taking those actions and learning of gaps before you have a recall event will help you execute a successful recall. Now going into HACCP. HACCP, in terms of the FDA requirements, applies to facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold seafood and 100% juice only. So enforcement of seafood HACCP began in the mid-90s and juice HACCP in the early 2000s. It's important to make a distinction that the HACCP for FDA is not equivalent to general HACCP schemes that are common in the food industry. So being certified by HACCP in the general sense does not necessarily mean that you are certified or compliant with seafood or juice HACCP under FDA requirements. So that is a common misconception, and I just wanted to address it. The main requirements include writing and implementing a HACCP plan. It is crucial to know that this will also require persons writing and implementing that are HACCP trained under a standardized curriculum recognized by the FDA. Again, because general HACCP programs or trainings will not cover the specificity of HACCP in 21 CFR 120 or 21 CFR 123. We will go into more details about the qualifications later on. Different from the Preventive Controls Food Safety Plan, there are no exemptions for very small businesses under the HACCP regulation. HACCP plans, like food safety plans, are also developed by product category. You can also group products that have similar characteristics and processing steps into one plan. The HACCP plan is a set of documents based upon HACCP's systematic approach for the identification, evaluation, and control of food safety hazards and delineates the procedures to be followed. You must develop a written hazard analysis to identify potential biological, chemical, and physical hazards and assess the likelihood and severity of the hazards to determine if they require a CCP or critical control point. Different from a food safety plan, HACCP focuses on critical control points that, as we mentioned, are equivalent to the food safety plan's process preventive controls. However, let's remember that the food safety plan also has the sanitation preventive controls, allergen preventive controls, and supply chain preventive controls. So in a HACCP system, when sanitation controls are critical to food safety, these are addressed through Sanitation Standard Operating Procedures, or SSOPs. CCPs are required to include monitoring, verification, and corrective actions, and they must be validated. The monitoring procedures list the activities and the frequency with which they are to be performed for each of the critical control points to ensure that the critical limits identified have been reached. When you monitor CCPs, you will also need to check that the control measure is working as intended through verifications as well. And validation is when you have confirmed that the parameters established are effective. The effectiveness of the plan needs to be validated. A HACCP plan must be reassessed at least annually. So different from a food safety plan, which is 3 years, a HACCP plan must be reassessed every year. And whenever changes impacting the plan occur in between, different than the preventive controls, which is 3 years. So for the intentional adulteration rule, aka the food defense rule, there are the mitigation strategies to protect food against intentional adulteration found in 21 CFR 121. This applies to facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold human food. It does not apply to animal foods. For holding foods, it's specific to holding in liquid tanks. The focus of a food defense plan is very different from a food safety plan, as it focuses on intentional harm, not on common foodborne illness or foodborne pathogens or contaminants that are likely or commonly found in a food. And these are not intentionally added to the products. The food defense plan must be developed and implemented by a food defense qualified individual. Now, the food defense plan applies to businesses that exceed $10 million in market in sales and market value of the food. So this also has exemptions for very small businesses, which are considered businesses under the 10 million threshold. So same as the food safety under preventive controls, those exemptions or those calculations apply when doing these calculations for the food defense plan. It's important to know that for food defense, there's no attestation needed for FDA. You will maintain your financial records and they must be available to FDA upon request. So then let's go into what a food defense plan is. It is a set of written documents that is based upon food defense principles and incorporates a vulnerability assessment, includes mitigation strategies, and delineates food defense monitoring, corrective action, and verification procedures to be followed. Like I mentioned, the focus of food defense is the vulnerability of the product during processing or holding in your facility, the accessibility that an employee or an attacker could have to the food. So there will be facility-wide measures that are crucial for food defense, but these can be general non-targeted practices or measures that protect personnel, property, or the product facility wide. And some of these measures can become a mitigation strategy. Facility-wide measures can include installing security cameras, fences, and lighting, limiting access to non-public areas, screening employees, contractors, and visitors before they come in to work or visit the facility, restricting visitors from food handling and storage areas, implementing background checks for job applicants, updating access control systems, or having a plan for reporting suspicious activity. These are all general precautions that you could normally find a facility, whether you are subject to food defense requirements or not. A vulnerability assessment is the equivalent to a hazard analysis in a food safety or HACCP plan. You evaluate each step, point in the food operation to identify where the risk is for an attacker to access the food and contaminate it. When an attack is likely, then that step becomes an actionable process step. For every actionable process step, there needs to be a mitigation strategy or combination of strategies. And these are the measures applied to prevent or reduce the likelihood for an attacker to access or contaminate the food. There are two main types of mitigation strategies: those that minimize the accessibility of the product to an attacker, and those that reduce the ability of an attacker to contaminate the food. Within these two main types, there is a subcategory of personnel and operations-based strategies or technology-assisted mitigation strategies. These strategies then must be monitored to ensure that they are being followed and are effective. Corrective actions must be in place to identify and correct issues promptly and reduce the likelihood of the problems reoccurring. Also, it requires a reanalysis at least every 3 years, and we have covered the components of all these required plans, and we can see how complex or overwhelming these requirements can be for someone with little or no experience in food safety or food defense. So that brings us to our next slide, which is the qualifications required to write and implement these types of plans and programs. So FDA requires qualified or trained individuals who have the education, training, experience, or a combination of these that are relevant to the food, the process, food safety, food defense, whatever is applicable. So here we show some examples of most common degrees or courses that can help in the development of qualified individuals, with a focus on food science or food safety, gives the person a solid foundation to understand and apply these requirements when they study or analyze them. So training reinforces that individual's understanding of the regulations. One thing is to be an expert in food safety or food defense, but another is to know and follow FDA requirements. So combining the educational foundation with the standardized training curriculums listed here then puts you in a better position to understand the requirements and develop and implement compliant plans or programs. The organizations that develop these training courses are the FSPCA, or Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, and the Seafood and Juice HACCP Alliances. The alliances are composed of individuals in government, industry, and academia stakeholders, that come together to uh, develop the standardized curriculums to be enforced by, not enforced, but to be approved by the FDA before they are considered the approved curriculum. So lastly, experience in the areas of food processing, food safety, and quality can be very beneficial. However, the experience to consider a person qualified depends on the scope of the work, the activities or responsibilities that person has performed, and continuous learning throughout those roles. So, for example, working 20 years in a food facility does not mean that person is qualified or knowledgeable in the FDA food safety requirements. Those are things that sometimes we hear. Oh, I've worked with the industry 20 years, but they're still not familiar with the specifics on the FDA requirements. So a combination of these three elements is essential for success and for having a well-rounded plan or program established. So let's go into preliminary steps for developing these plans. Food safety plans and HACCP plans are similar, and they would require very similar preliminary steps to move forward in developing these plans. The first step is to designate a team, a food safety team, and leader. And the leader would likely be the person that is either a PCQI or is the HACCP trained individual that is going to lead that team and ensure that information or the responsibilities of that team are achieved in accordance to the FDA requirements. Excuse me. Then you must describe the product. The understanding the product characteristics is crucial to then move forward into developing a hazard analysis. Same applies for developing a process flow diagram and describing the processing steps. If you have limited information on the product, if you don't have a full understanding of every step in the process, then that is likely to cause gaps in your hazard analysis and leave you vulnerable to, your food safety practices vulnerable. Then you consider also your own product's history. How has this product been, a cause for recalls in the past? Has this raw material been a subject to or the cause of a foodborne illness, an outbreak? And then within your own facility, in my facility, what is my product's history? Have I had a recall? Have I had issues with sanitation or hygienic practices, then understanding your own facility also helps you create a more robust food safety and HACCP plan. With supply chain program, it's important to identify the raw materials requiring supply chain controls. So, like we mentioned, when you understand your processing steps and how that food is going to be processed further down your process, then you can identify which ingredients and raw materials are going to require a supply chain control and which suppliers will require to be in your supply chain program. You will describe the raw material just like we do for the food safety or HACCP plan, understand the product, its characteristics to be able to identify the hazards. Consider your supplier's process flow diagram and their practices in order to understand which control measures they are applying. Do they have a drying step? Do they have a baking step? Do they have metal detection? You want them to control those hazards, so you have to understand what steps in their process you would need to monitor to ensure that the product you're receiving is safe. Consider your supplier's history. So if your supplier has had food safety issues in the past, if they have recurring issues, that's a red flag for you. So what are you going to do to ensure that your supplier's food that you're receiving is safe? Have they made the proper corrective actions? Have they changed their food safety plan, to address any issues? Or have they had a good history with you and, with food safety in general? Then those are things you must consider to approve your suppliers. So when developing a hazard analysis for food safety or HACCP, you must consider the biological, chemical, and physical hazards. But you also, in doing that hazard analysis, must be mindful of where the food came from, where did it originate from? Is it from a country that usually has issues with a particular pathogen or pesticide residues? That is information that is important in your hazard analysis. Understanding the characteristics of the products and ingredients, the intended use of that food. Is it going to be further processed? Is it a ready to eat food? Is it sent directly to consumers? It's important to understand what is the subsequent process for that food. Processing steps and the equipment type that is used, how the activities are conducted for those processing steps. Is it manual? Is it automated? How activities are conducted is important because automated processes can cause different hazards than manually operated or manually conducted. The packaging materials and the internal atmosphere of the packaging. Is it oxygen permeable? Is it a reduced oxygen packaging that can cause, anaerobic bacteria to grow and contaminate the food? Are there specific storage requirements needed for safety? Does this product require refrigeration? Does it require freezing? Or is it shelf stable? The food safety history of the product and or the supplier is critical as well to identify hazards that may not be obvious in their food safety plan or in their process, but then history shows that they have particular issues specific to their facility or their products. Now, preliminary steps to developing a recall plan is also to designate a team and leader. Designate responsibilities. It is critical not only to have an SOP with a bunch of steps or listing the instructions of what needs to be done, but you must designate specific roles to specific people. So it's important it doesn't have to be the name of the person, but maybe their role. This role is for the production manager. This role is for the quality assurance manager, or this role is for the machine operator, or this, you have to be specific so that when the recall event happens, it's a matter of executing that plan and you're not discussing or pointing fingers as to who is going to do what responsibility. Consider the product types. different product types may require different recall procedures. Some products you might decide, oh, they must be destroyed if this issue happens, but others you might decide that they are reworked, or you might have different procedures for different product types. Consider the supply chain. Is this a food that goes directly to consumers, or is it a food that goes to another entity? And that will change the approach of the recall event. Then consider your own recall history. What have I learned from the past? Or what have if I've had a recall, how did that go? What changes needed to be made to ensure that this new recall plan is effective or improved? Then food defense, you must also designate a a food defense leader, and describing the product is also important for food defense. There are certain types of foods that are less likely to be an issue for food defense than others. So like we mentioned, storing in liquid tanks, a liquid is very easy for a contaminant to distribute itself among the entire product. But if you have a product that is solid, if somebody were to spill something on it or pour something on it, a very small amount of that product would be contaminated. So understanding the product is important in determining the risk and wide scale harm. Develop a process flow diagram. Understand the processing steps. Is this and the equipment? Is this an equipment that is open to the environment? Is it enclosed, which prevents people from contaminating the product? Understanding the process and the equipment will help you also identify the areas that are vulnerable for contamination. Consider the facility-wide measures and other controls that you already have. So like we mentioned, if there are security cameras, if there are areas that are closed out to the to the employees or visitors, that already can help be a hurdle for the product to be contaminated. And consider your food defense history. Have you ever had an instance where an attacker contaminated your product? Then consider what you need to improve and where the gaps were. What I must consider when developing a vulnerability assessment for food defense is understanding the type of food, also the origin of the food, the receiving and handling and storage practices, again, to understand where vulnerabilities can lie, the quantity of food that is handled. Food defense focuses on wide scale harm. So if I'm handling very small amounts of food, that is very unlikely to have a big impact to the consumers. So understanding your operation and the scale of your operation is important. The processing steps, the activity types, and the equipment use, again, to make sure that you have evaluated how accessible that product is to the people working around it. How activities are conducted. There's an example that, if you would have employees in a segregated area working by themselves, it's my job to take samples of a product, and I'm by myself in the storage warehouse. There's no cameras, there's nobody supervising. That is an area where food defense measures need to be improved, because I could contaminate it and nobody would know. So having those segregated areas or doing activities that are for one employee to do by themselves, that can lead to a vulnerability in your food defense measures. The history of the product and or suppliers. So understanding the product that you're receiving, your supplier's measures. You must ensure that the food that you've received is not contaminated, and that it's not contaminated throughout your process. And again, reiterating, does this cause wide scale harm? That is a key question throughout the vulnerability assessment to identify whether it requires a mitigation strategy or not. Now we're moving to the most common FDA observations. This was taken from FDA data in the FDA data dashboard and their websites. Um, so regarding food safety plans, one of the most common observations is missing hazards. So as I mentioned before, FDA is very particular about their regulations. They have specifics within their regulations that might not be covered in other schemes or in other countries. So that's why it's important to, in addition to having that food safety background or education, training, or experience, it's important to be familiar with FDA and what has been common issues with products distributed in the United States. So maybe a particular hazard hasn't been an issue in your country, but in the United States, maybe is one of the most common causes for recalls, and the FDA would expect you to identify that in your product as a potential hazard. So that's why it's important to understand FDA guidance and regulations to be sure your plan covers the potential hazards and you can assess the likelihood and severity of those hazards in your hazard analysis. Then another common observation is no food safety plan at all. So some companies are processing their products, producing food, and they don't have a food safety plan in place. Then the third is missing preventive controls. So again, FDA is very particular about the types of control measures that they expect to be identified as such in a food safety plan. And maybe under HACCP, under general HACCP schemes or other certifying bodies, your controls were fine, but FDA expects a particular step to be a preventive control based on the requirements under preventive controls. A supply chain program, the most common observations include no verification activities. So maybe they've identified the supplier, they've identified the hazards in the food in their process, but they have not identified verification activities for the incoming raw materials. That should be under the supply chain program. Another observation is they did not approve suppliers. This is very common. Um, Businesses might have a sort of kind of as a supply chain program in place, but they're not conducting an evaluation of the suppliers for approving them. And it is important to approve suppliers based on an evaluation of compliance. Then you determine whether they're compliant or not. And if they're compliant, you can proceed to approve them. But if they're not compliant, the FDA requires you to request them to take corrective actions before you can approve them. If you cannot determine compliance for a supplier, the FDA would expect you to discontinue that supplier. Then on-site audit did not review the supplier's plan. So like I mentioned earlier, when you are evaluating a supplier's compliance, evaluating their food safety plan is going to be critical to ensure that they have a hazard analysis, they have identified the proper control measures, and they are ensuring that the food they're delivering to you is safe. Then you, as part of your supply chain program, verify that whatever control measure they've applied has been effective and your product is ready to be used. For a recall plan, the observations include no recall plan. So there's no recall plan in place. This is very worrisome because a recall plan must be executed very promptly. There's no time to waste when a recall event is happening. The more time spent, that is more time for the product to be distributed to more consumers and cause more illness or injury or even death, depending on the hazard. So it's critical to have a recall plan. And I recommend it even if you're not required to have one, even if you haven't identified a significant hazard for your process, it's always good to have one for some products in case an issue arises. You already have a plan in place to recall your product. Another observation is that they did not identify the steps. So they had a recall plan, but they did not have specific steps to follow. in the matter that FDA requires them to be. So you must be specific about the actions that need to be taken. And you also, the last observation is that there were no responsibilities assigned. So once we have those steps, is to identify who is going to execute, which which person in the company, which role is going to be responsible for this. It is important, again, I will say, to conduct those mock recalls and have training for your recall team to ensure that they've agreed to, take that action when it happens, that they are aware of their role within a recall event, so that at the time of a recall, they're not trying to figure out, oh, how do I do this? How do I execute this step? No, they should already know exactly what to do, and the recall plan should be thorough enough that there is no question about the actions that need to be taken. With HACCP, common observations include an inadequate implementation of the plan. So the HACCP plan can be perfect, but then it's not being implemented. And this is, I would say, a very common observation throughout all the facilities. You can have a perfect food safety plan or a perfect HACCP plan, but then you're not conducting the monitoring activities that you say you will conduct. You're not conducting the verification activities. You're not sanitizing or cleaning surfaces as you would describe in your HACCP plan. So it is important that those measures are actually being followed and implemented adequately, because that is a big risk food safety wise. The HACCP plan has no hazard analysis. So we've encountered this a lot as well, where a HACCP plan or master HACCP plan is developed, meaning only the CCPs are recorded or documented in a written form. So the employees follow the CCPs, but the facility has no hazard analysis written out. So it is important that the assessments done as part of those evaluations to identify the critical control points, that hazard analysis of each step in the process is written. That can also, if you don't have that in writing, that's a gap that can result in an inadequate master HACCP plan. Then missing critical control points. Again, this can vary in different countries, that some CCPs are not considered as CCPs, in their country, but the FDA does consider these to be CCPs. So it's important to know what the FDA would consider CCPs to make sure that that is not an observation that you received. And then food defense is one of the latest regulations that came into force. So the only observation right now that FDA is providing is no food defense plan. That's what they're encountering in these inspections. So it's important that you get to work. If the food defense plan is applicable to you, you are over the $10 million threshold for human foods, then you must have a written food defense plan in place. Now we can go over some common registrar corp observations. We have evaluated thousands upon thousands of plans during our courtesy reviews. We conduct a free assessment to just let companies know if they're in the right direction with FDA requirements or if they have some gaps. So through these, very frequent courtesy reviews that we conduct, we sort of have already our most common observations as well. So one of them is the plans do not consider all the applicable FDA food safety requirements. So like I mentioned, you might be compliant with your country's food safety system or with a specific HACCP scheme or certification, but that does not mean that you have considered all of FDA's requirements that are necessary to be in your plan. Second, the hazard analysis is too general or missing potential hazards. The FDA requires hazards to be specifically listed. You cannot just say pathogenic contamination or biological hazards are likely in this step. That is too vague and does not let you address the significant problems that might be in your food. So you must be specific to the hazards. Chemical contamination is likely, or environmental contamination. What type of contamination? What type of pathogen is going to be a problem? Then the next one, preventive controls or CCPs are identified as prerequisite programs. So that aligns with FDA's observation of missing critical control points because the facility might consider them under prerequisite programs or as a general measure, but not significant enough to be a CCP, but the FDA would deem otherwise. Next is finalized plans are not signed and dated by the owner or operate or person in charge of the facility. Once you develop these plans, they must be signed and dated. With each version, make sure, and this is just part of document management. Once you develop a new version of the plan, give it a new number, identify it somehow. It's a new date or effective since March 13, 2025. Whenever you make changes, it's important that the PCQI or the HACCP trained individual that is developing these plans signs and dates, but not only them, the owner or person in charge of the facility, because this shows their commitment to food safety. Uh, Quality departments cannot sustain food safety on their own if they don't have management support. So by the owner or operator in charge signing that document, they are committing to providing the resources necessary to ensure that plan is executed effectively for food safety. Next one is plans were not developed by a qualified individual trained under the standardized curriculums. Like I've also mentioned, if you have the Food Safety Foundation or Food Defense Foundation, that is a great start. However, understanding FDA requirements and their standardized curriculum is a separate thing. So make sure that you're trained up, that you've read the regulation, that you take advantage of the free resources that the FDA has on their website, such as guidances. And if it's too overwhelming, we'll lead the way. We understand the requirements. We work with them every single day. We know the requirements and we can help you navigate them. The next one, inconsistent information throughout different documents composing the plan. This is again a document management issue. When there's information in the process flow diagram that doesn't match the process description or doesn't match the steps in the hazard analysis, or where a particular practice is described in another document, but then when it's in the food safety plan is written differently, it's a different practice. So that causes confusion within your food safety, the people executing the food safety program. And it is important that you have you're effective and efficient in how you develop those documents, where the procedures are, prevent duplicate information in different types of records so that if you change the food safety plan, you don't have to change 10 other documents because that's overwhelming. People don't have time. You're in a very fast-paced environment, and that can cause you to forget that you had to change those 10 other documents to reflect the new procedure. So being efficient in how those plans and procedures are documented is very important to ensure to prevent that confusion. Then lastly, the plans are outdated, not reanalyzed per FDA's timeframe requirements. So we've had plans that, oh yeah, here's our food safety plan, and it's from 2016. It's like, ooh, it's been 9 years since you've revised this plan. So it's important that you keep that 3-year minimum. But remember that every time there's a change in your process, your product formulation, your packaging, the steps, the equipment, it's important to see how does this impact my current process? How does this impact my food safety plan so that you can make the changes accordingly and make sure that whatever change you made doesn't impact the safety of your finished product. So this finalizes the presentation portion, and we would like to invite you to our next webinar of our food safety series, which is Food Safety and Labeling Best Practices for Compliance. Did you know that two of the most common reasons that food products are refused at entry into the United States are labeling mistakes and illegal food additives? So companies don't discover that their products are not permitted in the United States until it's too late and they are detained at the port, or they must even issue a recall of their products. So any company selling and distributing food in the United States must ensure that their products, ingredients, and labeling are compliant with the FDA requirements. In this webinar, we will present the mandatory information that must appear on all retail food labels and describe how FDA regulates the ingredients. We will also highlight how compliant labels contribute to food safety. So join us and discover how to avoid these pitfalls that may result in compliance actions and harm consumers. So that will be for April, for next month. So stay alert for our invitation. And now we're moving on to the Q&A session. Please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box at the top right of your screen. You will see a little box with a question mark, and we will gladly answer your questions. So one question that we receive very often is, I am certified FSQF. I am certified under HACCP. Does that make me exempt from FDA, or does that make me compliant with the FDA? And the answer is no. Being certified under these food safety schemes that are accepted, for, it's a common industry practice or industry requirement. Your clients may require you to be SQF certified or, to be HACCP certified, because those help you have a food safety management system, but it doesn't necessarily ensure that the hazards that you've identified are correct, or that your process ensures food safety. So you have to make sure that whatever food safety scheme that you're choosing does meet FDA requirement. There are some food safety schemes that have FSMA modules that might have preventive controls modules or FSBP modules, and that can be a better determinant of whether you're compliant with FDA or not. But having general schemes or certifications will not guarantee that you are compliant with the FDA. Now, Anja asked, which missing preventive action measures were observed? So the FDA does not go into that detail in their FDA dashboard. They provide a general observation. Those specifics would be found in a company's 483 document. A 483 is a form where the FDA lists observations during an inspection. So at the end of an inspection, the inspector will have some time. They will draft a 483 when observations are found and tell that company, you did not provide, you did not have identify all the preventive control measures. And then they can elaborate a little bit underneath. For your metal detection step, you did not identify this as a preventive control. They can give that information, but they won't necessarily publish that. They will do so in the 483. Then Huey Wong asked, if CCP needs to be controlled by end user consumer like cooking, what other preventive controls can be applied to address biological hazards? That is a wonderful question. So when a food is meant to be cooked, the FDA would expect that food to not have pathogenic bacteria. So it is normal that a food is going to have an expected microbial load because it's not going to be sterile. However, finding E. coli in food is not common. That shows the food was exposed to contamination throughout the process or in the farm. So E. coli is a pathogen that is indicator of contamination in water, that human waste or animal waste was, within the area that the food was grown. And in the facility, it shows improper hygienic practices. So E. coli is not something that you can say, oh, the consumer can control that. Same with salmonella. It also shows that there are parts of the process or the growth of a food that were exposed to contamination. So the FDA would expect pathogenic bacteria to not be present. There are other pathogens, for example, Bacillus cereus is one that its toxin is the cause of illness. So it is common that Bacillus is naturally found in rice, for example. It is normal that the spores could be present, but once you cook the rice, you know, bacillus is not an issue until you leave that food under temperature abuse. So it is normal that bacillus spores are found in rice, but the control measure there would be for the consumer after they've cooked the rice to not leave it under temperature abuse. So it would not be your job to control bacillus cereus spores in that product. So that's just an example. But there are indicators, that's why you need a qualified individual, because if you're trying to figure out which pathogens are likely in your food, which hazards you need to control, you need to have someone with that education in microbiology, food safety, food science, to understand how microbes, work in the food and which hazards you would have to identify. So Oscar asked if the attendees of the presentation will receive a certificate or copy of the presentation. We will provide a copy, a record of the recording of this webinar. We do not issue a certificate because this is not an official course, so there's no certificate to provide at the end. We do have online training, however, so if you do want to take online courses, we have a wide variety of food safety related courses that you can take. We have courses from the approved standardized curriculums, as well as other general courses that are more related to GMPs and hygiene, sanitation, and other short courses related to microbiology and food and those types of topics. Courses related to certifications. So SQF and FSSC, for example, are part of our courses. If you're interested, just reach out to us. Lorenza asks, is it necessary to have specific FDA training in order to do a food defense plan, similar to training for PCQI? So you are not required to have the training by FDA. That is optional. However, it is strongly recommended because when you say you're a PCQI, then by taking the course, you have a stronger case to prove to the FDA that you are actually understand or were exposed to the material that the FSPCA put together. There are ways you can also be a PCQI based on experience by itself. But if the FDA is inspecting you, they found deficiencies in your plan and they're asking, who's your PCQI? And you say, I am, but I have never taken the course. Then the FDA might say, well, you should take it. There were some deficiencies in the plan that would have been, could have been prevented if you had taken the standardized curriculum. However, that does not mean you have to, but make sure that if you don't have the standardized curriculum training, that you have read the regulation, that you have evaluated FDA guidance, that you have taken that into consideration when writing your plan. For food defense is the same way. They have a standardized curriculum because that is, what FDA has approved. However, we understand and they understand there are other food safety, food defense courses out there that can very well be, sufficient to address your food defense measures in your facility. So FDA doesn't necessarily care where you got the information from. If your food defense is thorough, it meets all the requirements, you've implemented measures that protect against an attacker in an effective way, that's what FDA will care about at the end of the day. So they have those trainings as optional, but we strongly recommend because there can always be gaps when you rely on other materials to create your plans. So Beatrice asks, where can I access these courses? So if you're interested in our courses, please, you have our information right here at registrarcorp.com. You can find online training in there, and it'll lead you to our online training page. If you have trouble finding that, then please email us at info@registrarcorp.com, and one of our specialists there will give you the information to access the online training. They'll redirect you to that team. Okay. So are there any other questions? Yeah, so I would just like to take the opportunity and reiterate the importance of understanding the FDA requirements for HACCP. HACCP for seafood and juice have very particular requirements in regulation and in FDA guidance documents. FDA has been very thorough in providing guidelines for what they expect to see in these HACCP plans, and it's important that you are familiar with those requirements in addition to general HACCP practices. So I reiterate the importance of that. I also remind you that food defense plans only apply to human foods. Animal foods are exempt from the food defense plan requirements. Okay. But there aren't any more questions, then I will close out this webinar. We thank you again for joining and for your time. And we hope this information has been very valuable to you. I remind you that we have a short 5-question survey following the webinar. So once you close out, you will get those 5 questions. And it's very short. Just please give your feedback. Let us know if the information is useful to you, any way that we can improve. And we will see you in the next webinar for food safety and labeling in April. Thank you so much. Have a great day.